Greetings, everyone. I think we will begin. Thank you all for coming. It's a sign of the quality of our guest and the quality of his book that so many of you are here, so thanks for coming. My name is Jim Fallows. I'm a writer for the Atlantic, friend of Rob Schmitz's from our time in Shanghai. How many of you personally know Rob already? How many of you have already read his book? So I have already read his book, and at the end of this session, we're going to have a book sales and book signing opportunity when we end about an hour from now. I'll tell you, I have already read his book, and I have two things to say about it. One is you will notice the infinity of little yellow stickies here. These are all the pages where there's something I wanted to ask Rob about. The other is those of you in the writing biz, and I know there's a number of you here, will appreciate the way I'm going to make this point. Rob is a friend. I said, yeah, I'd like to read his book. And what I can tell you is it's actually very good. You know, you read books by your friends, say, yeah, it's fine. But this is actually a great book. And more than a really good book, it's something that I think will have a life when it comes to discussions of China over the years. So let me say a word about Rob for those of you who don't happen to know him already, and then a little bit more about the book, since I'm the main one to have read it here. As you know, Rob's been in Shanghai for 8 or 9 years for Marketplace?
6 years.
6 years? Well, how time flies. He first went to China as a Peace Corps volunteer 20 years ago to Sichuan, there for a couple of years, after being a Spanish major at University of Minnesota Duluth. You know, you were misinformed or whatever, but it all worked out.
It did.
And your job after the Peace Corps was?
After the Peace Corps, I came back and taught taught Spanish. Of course, which is what you do. Right?
So, slow to get the point, but eventually he got the point, went back to China other times, and has been doing great work for Marketplace. Probably the time when the outside world, noticed Rob's work in a way they couldn't ignore was when he sort of blew the whistle on Mike Daisy, as you recall from the reports from Shenzhen, which were interesting to me. And he's been doing a series on which this book is based. What I love about this book is the challenge of trying to just say anything about China is, of course, encompassing the things that are contradictory, inexplicable, bizarre, touching, depressing, et cetera, without just saying, oh, China, land of contrasts. So people do it in various ways, and often the most successful ones are people who can find a particular thread and say, by telling you about the universal and the particular, by saying, here's a story of this family, this village, this company, this X, Y, or Z, you can tell some suggestion about the larger country. And in his story, Street of Eternal Happiness, I think Rob has done that in a really amazing way. By serendipity or by doggedness, you found people who touch almost every element of the modern Chinese story that you'd like to know about. People who had suffered in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, people who had come in from the countryside, people who were successful entrepreneurs, people who were fraudsters, people who'd gone to America, people who were struggling with religion or memory or anything else. So I think that as this book gets around, people will say, this is a way to try to know about all the different elements of China. So, Rob, would you like to make a one-sentence reply at this point?
Thank you very much, Jim.
Any time. So let me say, so there are, as you see from these Post-it notes, a lot of things I want to ask about. Let me just start with the basic thing, which I'm sure you've had a chance to talk about on the book tour for the last while, which is how you ended up finding the cast of characters that have this very remarkable way of telling lots of the story of China through their stories.
Yeah, there are about 5 narratives that kind of run through this book. The original Street of Eternal Happiness was a radio series that I had done for Marketplace, and it lasted over about a year, 2012 to about 2013. I had one story per month about the people who live and work along a single street in Shanghai. It was the street I happened to live on. It was very manageable because I didn't have to walk very far or even go very far to report this series. But part of the impetus of this series was, it had been 2 years since I had arrived in Shanghai as a Marketplace reporter. I'm the only reporter for Marketplace in China, and China's economy is kind of a big thing. And I was pretty overwhelmed by a lot of the things that I had to cover, and so I wanted to take a step back and cover a lot of the changes that were happening through the eyes of normal, everyday people along, on one street. So a lot of actually 3 of the characters in the book and were in the original series, and were people that I had originally met doing that series. And after the series, I kept in touch with them and kept kind of talking to them. Once I had the book contract, I had met Auntie Fu and Uncle Feng, who are one of the narratives in the book. They were the only ones who I had met, only cast of characters that I had met after I knew I was going to actually write a book.
I'm going to start with a semi-topical question. As you've probably learned by coming back to the U.S. in these last couple of weeks, there's a lot of coverage about the problems China is having: political, economic, short-term, long-term, military, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a line you have early in your book when you're introducing one of your characters, which, first I'll read the line, then I'll ask you the question.
Sure.
It says, "The longer I lived in China, the more I realized that for every dreadful story that dragged my pessimism for the country's future to a new low, there was someone like Wei Qi who could restore my hope. Wei Qi's story alone encompassed opposite poles of this duality." The topical question I have to ask you is, as you come back from China to this U.S. news environment of struggling, downbeat China, how do you think about it? How do these sort of contradictory stories like Wei Qi's fit into your presentation of China's prospects?
Yeah, I actually think that, so Wei Qi is a character who is the son of a man who was killed for the land that I live on, the complex that I live on. And this comes from, I was doing some looking into this neighborhood across the street that when I moved in was this sort of abandoned neighborhood that had been sort of burned down. And there was a very interesting story about this that I tell in the book. In the process of doing that, in the process of reporting that, I wanted to look at actually what happened to my piece of land. And Wei Qi, his father, died for the land for the apartment complex that I live in, my family and I live in. And so it's his story.
And explain how, if you would.
Well, explain his story. So Wei Qi ends up. So I meet his mother first because I hear there's a widow of this man, and so I find her and I meet her, and her story is absolutely just heartbreaking. She, after her husband died and was burned to death, the police claimed in the report that he set himself on fire. She believes that that's not true, and all other evidence points to murder, especially since the guys who did this 10 years later murdered an elderly couple across the street the same way. They burned them to death for their home. She ends up spending years, actually more than now 2 decades, petitioning the government in Beijing. She goes to Zhongnanhai, which is the seat of the central government in China, where the leadership do their business, off of Tiananmen Square. She goes there. She throws out flyers or unfurls a banner. She is tackled by police. She's sent to a place called Majialo, which is a underground prison for petitioners in Beijing. She spends 2 weeks there, let out, and she goes straight back to Zhongnanhai and does the same thing. She's done this dozens of times over the years. So her mission has taken a toll on her. And when she told me that she had a son, I thought, oh, geez, what happened to this kid? Because he was 10 years old when his father died. And so I was almost scared to ask her. And I said, well, where is your son? And she said, oh, he's finishing up his PhD at Cornell. And so it was one of these stories, and in finance, and he's working at one of the biggest banks in the world in Hong Kong, doing derivatives trading. And it was like one of these many moments, and you know this, Jim, from reporting in China, where you just kind of have to slap yourself. This is incredible. And so this portion of the book, I talk. Wei Qi worked so hard. All odds were against him to do this, and he did it. And in some ways, he's absolutely an inspiration. And I think that it shows that even under these incredible circumstances in China, that you can succeed. There is room for success, even under this system, obviously. And I think, the headlines that we see about China, which are, oppressive system, and the poor people of China, the Chinese on an individual level have a fairly high degree of freedom. And I think that that's something that oftentimes you don't see in the headlines. And this is something that I wanted to capture in this book.
And to extend that one more topical link, from the outside perspective, through such things as getting visas, using VPNs, other ways of just dealing with China, it's become sort of inarguably tighter in the last 2 or 3 years.
Right.
How much of that shows up in daily life on your street?
It doesn't. These are things that foreigners care about. Chinese don't. Usually, normal everyday Chinese aren't. They don't. They don't pay attention to the web censorship. This is something that most of the sites that they're on, they can get, and it's pretty fast. So when you talk about internet censorship, VPNs, which is something that foreigners want because they want to access their foreign sites like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and et cetera, that's something that we grouse about all the time. I grouse about it all the time. I usually don't take it to the airwaves for Marketplace because it's something that I don't really think is indicative of everyday Chinese.
Another thing which is really impressive about your book, I think, and true to my much more limited sense of China than yours, again, is this vivid humanness in its highs and its lows. And the cover of the book is very much the spirit of the place, this little child beaming. Is this a real child in the street?
Yeah, and not on the street, but that's Sue-Ann Tay, who is a photographer in Shanghai. You might know her. She took that, actually, I think it might have been in the same district, I'm not sure, but that's obviously Shanghai. You've got the hanging clothes behind him and all that stuff. That's like the trademark of the
it's a beautiful, happy little boy. At the same time, a lot of the tales you tell are just chilling and sobering, mainly in about suppressed memory and expunged memory of the 50s and 60s, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. Tell us a little bit about the Wang family and their letters. And what you inferred about the role of suppressed memory in China now.
Yeah. So there's one narrative that threads through the book. I have friends of mine who lent me a box of letters that they bought at a junk shop in my neighborhood, and this box of letters all these letters were written between a husband and his wife. The husband was arrested in 1957 as a rightist and a capitalist, and sent to Qinghai province to reform through a labor camp, basically. He leaves behind his wife and 7 children on the street. And the reason that they gave this to me is because they had heard the series on Marketplace, and they said, we've got all these letters that are addressed to the street that you're profiling. And I said, well, I'd like to see those. And they said, no, we want to give them to you right now. So I poured through all those letters, and the story they tell is just one. It's really a part of the story because it's not all the letters, and a lot of the letters were lost, and most of the letters are written from the wife to the husband. There's a few from the husband to the wife, and so you can kind of start to kind of see what's happening here. And these are terrible years. I mean, the wife gives away her youngest daughter to strangers during the famine, and after reading letters, I ended up finding the only son, which was of course the youngest child in this family, and which
now lives in
Flushing, New York. And when I knocked on the door, and the woman would say, "Well, they're in New York," and actually the wife in the letters, she's still alive. She has Alzheimer's, so she's suffering from that. And the son brought her to New York. They actually won the visa lottery of all things, and so he's in Flushing. He's assembling or reassembling cell phones at a Korean plant full of Chinese workers. Lives in Flushing, so he's almost like in China again. And he ends up studying at the Flushing Library, and this is one of these things where I kept meeting him at the Flushing Library, and I slowly was reminded of how important the public library system is in the United States. Public libraries are something that are just incredible, and at this library, the Flushing Library, you had immigrants from all over the world studying English, getting their GED, getting free classes on how to find jobs, and all of these amazing services, all for basically free. And that is what he did. He used all of these classes. He just got his GED. He's 58 years old. He just graduated from a U.S. high school, equivalency, and he has a dream, and he's not stopping. And so those interviews with him were just fascinating, because when I asked him about what had happened to his father, and there's a part in the book where I'm asking, because he told me, look, my father died in a nursing home alone. I said, well, that's odd. There's 7 kids. That's very odd for in China to have your father die alone in a nursing home. Because usually the kids will be taking care of the father. And so I asked him. I said, well, what do you think about what happened to your father? And he told me something that was very surprising to me. He said, because this was madness this time, obviously, and he was rounded up because he was a capitalist. He owned a factory, and his son said he should have known. He should have known, because when you're Chinese, you adjust. You understand what's happening around you, and you can read the weather patterns. You understand that. He never understood that, and so he was punished, and that made life hell for my sisters and I, for our entire lives. Our entire lives was basically boiled down to that moment where he was arrested. Right. That response taught me so much. As a writer and as a reporter, and I'll never forget it. Obviously, it's a big part of this book.
So Rob and I did not set this up, but your pitch about the public library is exactly in sync with what my wife Deb has been writing in her actually very good article in The Atlantic and on their website about libraries, because they have this role all around the country. I want to push on the business of memory of those years again. Around the rest of the world, there's increasing emphasis on sort of historical, facing the facts historically, that Georgetown University is going through its slave records, and Barack Obama is going to Hiroshima, and just a sense of truth and reconciliation, et cetera. One inference from your book is that this is just not happening at all in China, about the Mao era. Is that so, and what will it mean if a major country cannot deal with memory?
I think it's a big problem. I think that not only is China having a difficult time dealing with the Cultural Revolution, we just had the 50th anniversary last week of the Cultural Revolution, but it's having a very difficult time coming to terms with the famine. And I think that the famine in some ways is even more important. You had tens of millions of people who starved to death during that 4-year period. It is absolutely it's devastating. Many lives were touched by this. Many people know people, have relatives who either died or went through a very difficult time during that period. And here we have, especially now since Yang Jisheng's tombstone was published, which is the definitive work on this period, because he basically had access, he was a Xinhua reporter, he had access to official archives, official data about what was really going on back then. And that cannot be published inside of China. I think that's really, really that's unfortunate, and I understand intellectually why that is, because if you admit that was obviously due to the Great Leap Forward and due to Mao's policies, and if you say, okay, this led to the deaths of millions of people, then you start to question legitimacy of Mao. And Mao is on the money. He's on Tiananmen Square. And I think that it's very difficult right now to come to terms with this for the country and, most importantly, for the party.
So to take a change in tone from that heavy weatherism, I love about your book that it has a lot of the comedy of China. What would be a comic episode that sticks in your mind? It could be the sex therapy you got. It could be any...
I did not get the sex therapy.
Oh, no. Well, you'll have to read the book, see which of us is right. So, but any other?
Now you really want to read this book.
So just a way to convey when you think of just the absurd and the comic and the uplifting, what would it be?
Well, I think there's a character in the book, Auntie Fu, who is a force of nature. And Auntie Fu is in her 60s, and she comes from the same generation as Xi Jinping. She grew up during the Cultural Revolution. She did not have a school to go to because schools were closed during that time. Every decision that she faced career-wise throughout her whole life up until she was around 40 or 50 was made for her by the party. So like many people of this generation, when China, when capitalism started to seep into the fabric of China, she was lost. She didn't know how to operate in this new society. And she saw all of this wealth around her, and she wanted it. And so she, basically her narrative in the book is she's dragging me from one pyramid scheme meeting to another, trying to convince me to invest because she's investing her entire pension into these things. And they become more and more ridiculous, and I become more and more worried and concerned about her, trying to stop her from doing this. And the final one in the book is just absurd. It's this product that promises to rid you of toxins, and it's a pad that you stick in your underwear. And so there's this entire meeting where we're shown the magical, amazing qualities of these pads, and it's just, I've never seen anything like this.
And it was promised to give you new vigor, didn't it?
Yes, and fortunately I got out of putting one in, I did not use one. But Auntie did. Yes.
And so let me read what you wrote about her husband,
Okay.
Uncle Feng. So this is...
They don't get along very well.
And this is, I think, one of the last appearances he makes in the book. I glanced over at Uncle Feng under the covers and yearned to curl up in a fetal position beside him. On the surface, these two, Auntie and Uncle, appeared to live a life of simplicity. Tiny apartment, modest pensions, children and grandchildren to visit each weekend. Yet underneath were chaotic lives filled with deception, heartbreak, and greed. So put that in context for modern. So what part of the panorama of modern China should we assume that to be?
I think I really do think that can kind of put China into a nutshell in some ways. I think that there's a lot of, especially for her generation, things look so simple on the outside. And she's living on her pension. She lives in a very modest apartment. Her husband sells scallion pancakes out of their kitchen window. Things look very kind of, oh, this is so nice. Oh, it's great. And then as I got to know them, it was just it was incredible what was behind all of this, and the vitriol between the two over years and years of all of these things that they did that it was terrible. And so being with them was somewhat stressful. And at first I thought it was me. I thought oh, I'm having this impact on I'm affecting this whole thing, But I realized later that I really had nothing to do with this. This was their everyday existence. And I think in many ways there are a lot of people their age and that generation especially that have not really adjusted. Going back to the theme of adjustment, and that's a big theme in this book. They didn't really adjust. And that's sort of, in the book, I make a reference to living in China and living under the Chinese system is sort of like swimming in waters where there's a rip current. And if you've swum in waters with a rip current, or lived in California or anywhere, you know what to do, right? Because that rip current can take you out to sea pretty quickly. And so if you don't swim against it, it will take you out. So if you let it take you, it will take you, and you'll be lost. If you swim against it, what happens? You drown, right? You drown. You get exhausted and you drown. So if you fight it, you will drown. The way that you successfully get out of a rip current, and the way that some of the characters in my book successfully deal with this system that they're under, is they find a way to go with the current, but at their own sort of angle, at their own individual angle. And that's sort of how I see living in China for all the generations right now.
So I just have one or two more questions before I turn this over to the crowd and your friends here. There was a video that circulated maybe 3 or 4 days ago in the U.S. that got a lot of people's attention because it was a crowd scene in China with a policeman who held a pistol. And all these sort of Chinese people, might have been a traffic stop or something, but they just were yelling at him. They were upbraiding him. They weren't. If this were the U.S., the next part would have been the policeman shooting somebody.
Right.
And so I guess the part of it, there's the whole gun situation, which I'm not going down to. What I'm going instead is the mixed attitude of today's Chinese people to authority. You say they have to be aware of the landscape and which way the rip current is going. On the other hand, they're yelling at a policeman with a gun. So put this in context.
Well, I think in that situation, for sure, because I think that the way that the Chinese see police officers is that you're there to protect us. You're there to help. And that is, well, first of all, to see a Chinese police officer withdraw his gun is shocking. I think that I've never
except
seen
for
that.
Mike Daisy, right?
Except for Mike Daisy.
That's a whole backstory.
And that, security guards are taking out guns left and right, apparently. But for a police officer to take a gun out, that is unusual. And I think the fact that is so unusual was probably one of the reasons why I think we had a lot of people in that video up in arms about it, because that is unusual, it's uncalled for, it's completely inappropriate. And I think it speaks to the general idea of safety in China. Because I think, if for those of us who've been in China, how safe you feel when you walk down the streets in China.
Unless you're crossing the street.
Unless you're crossing a street, and you've got to deal with the drivers. But I think that's something that I've always loved about China. That in a city of 25 million or so, I can walk in the middle of the night and feel completely safe. And I think that there's that sense of safety, and that's something that I think that many Chinese have when they walk around in an urban place in China. I'm supposed to feel safe. And if this officer withdraws his gun, that is obviously not safe. And he probably doesn't know how to shoot it, in all likelihood.
One of the things I most enjoyed in Shanghai was the PLA shooting range. Did you ever go there?
Yeah, there's a shooting range on Huaihailu, right?
Yes,
is that the one?
right.
Yeah. The shooting range and bar. Don't forget that you can buy drinks while you shoot. Good fun.
So from a Western perspective, people would perceive a contradiction between the apparently increasing high-level control and sort of this willingness to push back. Is it a steady state equilibrium, do you think, between people's acquiescence in high-level control and the willingness to say, to protest their houses being seized, as you describe at length in here, to shout at policemen? Is that just a stable equilibrium?
That's a good question. I would love your thoughts on this too, because I don't know if I have a very good opinion about this that's accurate. I sort of think that even though things can seem sort of stable on the outside, and this goes back to Fu and Feng, things in China can be very chaotic and can turn chaotic very quickly, especially when you get a crowd of people. I've been in situations, folks who have. If you've ever been in China as a foreigner in a place where there aren't many foreigners, you've been in this situation where a crowd of people starts to surround you, and suddenly the unpredictable can happen. Something very unpredictable. Someone could throw something. Someone could suddenly say, the foreigners taking pictures because they're capturing our poverty. This is something that in the Peace Corps
hurting the feelings of
exactly, and things can turn very quickly. I don't know if that's a good answer or not to your question, but I do think that there's a reason why there's a lot of money being spent on domestic security in China, because it's not all that stable and things can turn very quickly. I think the Chinese, in many ways, when they act in groups, they act a lot like Americans. I think Americans too in a crowd can get angry as well. But the Chinese have these boiled up frustrations that have been kind of pent up for so many years, and so when they get in a situation like that, all these things can come out very quickly.
So one last question, not about your book, but about your life, and I'll set it up with an example from my life. When our kids So we had two sons who are now in their 30s, but when they were in elementary school age, we were living in Japan. We sent them to Japanese public school. Number one, we couldn't afford international schools. Number two, we thought it would be good for them, quote unquote. And it was good for them in language learning and toughening and things like that. But we realized it would not have been good for them to stay in there very long just because of the rigidities of Japanese education. You have your two young sons, Landon and Rainey, in Chinese public school.
Mm-hmm.
How long will you do that?
Well, we will do that up until the point where Rainey's 7 years old. He's in first grade in a local school. I think we're going to do that up until we think he's not enjoying it or it's just too much for him. First grade now, so Landon he's 4 years old. He's in a kindergarten. Rainey's always been he was 3 years in Chinese school, Chinese kindergarten, where he was the only foreigner in his class. And now he's in an international class, actually, of a Chinese school. Now, funnily enough, the international class is 2/3 Chinese because they're Chinese with foreign passports, which is pretty interesting. So they, everything is spoken in Chinese. He has math in Chinese. He has Yuan Ke, which is Chinese class. He has an English class that's taught in English, of course, but he's doing pretty well. But he has an hour of homework every day. He's 7 years old. I didn't have homework at all when I was 7 years old. He can handle it. And that's something that we've watched very carefully, my wife and I think that he can handle it at the point at which we feel like it's just he's losing out on his boyhood, or he's losing out on something's missing here. I think that we would consider something else.
And conceptually, is there a level of Chinese schooling at which you think its natural momentum is something you wouldn't want for your kids?
At third grade in Chinese schools, you're third or fourth grade, you have the political system sort of seep into the curriculum in China. And you'll have, the model of Lei Feng, or you'll have, the stories about that. You'll start to have stories of the old revolutionaries kind of pop in, and so that's when some of the politics starts to seep in. It could be argued that they're seeping in now. My son, it's a funny story. My son, one day it was raining outside, and he was coloring a picture, and I looked over his shoulder, and it was a picture of Tiananmen Square. It was the Gate of Heavenly Peace, and then the portrait of Mao was a smiley face. He just put two dots and a big smiley face, and then he had a bunch of people kind of milling about. He had the bridges, over the little emote, and then there were people stick figures that had hats on. And all of them had guns. And I said, who are these people, Rainey? He said, oh, those are police. And I said, well, why do they have guns? Why are their guns drawn? Because their guns were drawn. And I said, well, because they're allowed to have guns. It was kind of a boy thinking about, if I had a gun, I'd have the gun out. But it was so interesting, and so that color, that drawing is behind my desk in my office. That also told me, wow, this is really seeping in. So we're also kind of supplementing his education with American themes at home.
So who would like to ask a question of Rob? I will call on you, and then either I or Rob will repeat the question for the broadcast. Yes. Sir.
As early as the late 80s and early 90s, I observed people getting very excited, Chinese people getting excited about Mao memorabilia from the Cultural Revolution, not just to sell to foreigners, but almost like a talisman to replace religion or to add to the pantheon of gods. Sometimes within the same family where people were silent, where they had terroristic stories and memories, and there was kind of a dichotomy there. I wonder, in the present context, on your street, the microcosm of your street, how do you see that, and how do you see that as impacting sort of the daily life of people and how they address their memory?
A Mao memorabilia.
Yeah, I think That type of memorabilia, it's funny because in the 90s I used to see all that. That was very common. I don't see as much of that in today's China. Funnily enough, you see more Xi Jinping out there. There's a lot of Xi Dada stuff. Now we're not allowed to call him that apparently anymore. The Chinese media at least aren't called Big Daddy Xi. But I actually, honestly, in Shanghai, I don't see that much memorabilia at all. And so I think that there was a phase where people were, that was a big thing. But I don't. The issue you raise is very interesting, right? These were people who were probably, targeted because of campaigns from Mao. Their lives were probably ruined because of him, but I think if you would have asked them, was your life ruined by him? They would say no. He put China on the right path. He's 30% bad and 70% good, and they would toe that line. And I think they would see the part of Mao that was more the revolutionary era Mao, which was the Mao who, united all the workers, united farmers, and overthrew China and started a new China, where suddenly people were equal. And I think that lore, whether it's true or not, is something that I think that's how they see it. When I talk to Auntie Funako Fong, for example, they will, in one sentence, say, because they were sent out to Xinjiang to build the Bingtuan, which are the Bingtuan were these farms that were basically used to colonize Xinjiang from China after Mao took over China, because Xinjiang was this area in northwestern China that was full of ethnic minorities and really wasn't settled yet, and so they sent a bunch of people from the cities out there, and they were part of that. So Uncle Feng would complain about how awful and terrible life was there, and then just say that Mao was amazing in the same sentence. So for him, there wasn't any sort of contradiction in that.
So here and then over here, yes, so, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that Shanghai is also different than the rest of China. It has a very different feel there. So maybe in other parts of China now, memorabilia might be more impressive.
I think Shanghai perhaps used to be an anomaly in China. I think that because 40% of Shanghai now does not come from Shanghai, they're from the provinces, Shanghai has become more emblematic of a larger country than just Shanghai. And that didn't used to be the case, obviously, like in the pre-revolutionary, and absolutely in the first decades of communist control of China, Shanghai was quite different. And that's why the Cultural Revolution was so strong in Shanghai in some ways. I think now with the influx of migrants, I think the makeup of Shanghai, it's a very different Shanghai. And I don't know. I think it is more emblematic of a greater China, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering about, I think Rob, Mike Forsyth is a mutual friend of ours who was a former colleague of mine at Bloomberg. How worried were you about the government getting upset about anything you wrote? And when you wrote it, and particularly the characters in the street, did you edit anything out that you thought might upset them, get them in trouble?
And if you could rephrase the question in your
Yeah. So the question here is that if I cut anything from my reporting, right, or if I censored my own reporting because I was worried about what would happen after it aired. No, I didn't. I've never done that. And the one of the stories that ended up in the book, the Maggie Lane story, which is the area that was sort of torched and people died for this piece of land, that probably got me the most problems with local authorities than any other story in this book. And that's because it was a botched job by the city of Shanghai. And it made the city of Shanghai look bad. And so the city government, after that aired, sent their security officers to talk to my assistant. When she stopped talking to him, they then contacted me directly. And ever since then, I meet with them on a quarterly basis. And it's very interesting, these meetings. And actually, I look forward to them because these meetings are, these These are cops doing their job. And there's chit chat for about an hour. Just everything. They complain about their jobs. They don't make enough money. You can't climb the ladder of the PSB. And then I'll kind of listen to them for a while. I ask them a lot of questions. I'm really curious about their jobs and what they do. And then there's always like a bullet point at the end. Oh, and they go, there's going to be the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests, and make sure that blah blah. And so there's always like some bullet point that they have to, some box they have to check at the end, and it always comes at the end, and then we say, okay, see you, thank you. So these meetings are not as menacing as you would think. These are just guys doing their job, and I'm a guy doing my job, and I think we both understand that, and so it's not as horrible as you might think from looking at it from the outside.
How many other people here have been reporters in China? Just wondering if so have you held anything back for reasons for fear of censorship?
I was with the Shanghai Daily.
That's a whole separate story. Mr. Ambassador.
One question. As a journalist living in China, what would you say is the most misguided narrative taking place in the United States about China that living there you say that holds no water?
Yeah. Where do I start?
The question is, what's the most misguided U.S. impression of China?
I think that this idea that China is on the verge of collapse, just it boggles my mind, and and it's out there. It's very prominent. We're all scared that China's going to collapse. We're watching China. The Wall Street is watching China so carefully. So they move the renminbi placing up a tiny bit or down a tiny bit, and Wall Street just goes bonkers, right? That is something that, from the ground level, I don't see this happening anytime soon. And part of the reason I don't see this happening anytime soon is that I think that there are two Chinas happening right here. There's a China that's being covered in the Western media, I think, that is the party, and it's the macroeconomy, it's the markets, it's all of these big things. And then there's the other China, there's the real people of China that have built their own economy, and it functions pretty well. And so if that macroeconomy starts to cave in, or the markets start to fall a little, in many ways, that the ground level economy is okay because they're doing well. There's everyone's saying, oh, look at the Soviet Union, how it collapsed. Well, if you remember this book from David Remnick, Lenin's Tomb, where he writes about $1 million worth of salmon rotting in nets, dying in their nets because this is the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the fishermen were state workers, and they were waiting for orders from the central authorities to kind of net these fish, and they just died. If you've been in China, do you think that would happen in China? Absolutely not. That would never happen there, right? And so some folks are saying, oh, it's going to have this stagnation like Japan. Again, I'm not sure, because Japan, when it started to stagnate in the 90s, most people in Japan were already in the middle class. They were consumers. They had a cushion behind them. China still has about 500 million people that have still not ascended to the consumer class. These are hungry people. They are hungry to make money, still. And so I'm not sure that scenario plays out for me either. So when I look at the real people of China, I have a lot of optimism, despite all of these headlines about, oh, the economy is going to fall apart and the whole world is going to fall apart. So I'm not sure, yes, there are some troubling signs. Yes, debt is very high. Yes, there has been no country ever that has gone, without a crisis with the debt level that China has. I see China as a unique country, and I think it can defy a lot of expectations.
Interestingly, when we knew each other in China, so from 2006 to 2010, my impression was the opposite. The misimpression in the U.S. was that China was unstoppable, was going to take over everything.
Well, that is also a myth, right? I think,
right, yes.
That's, and not to say that China is going to take us over. Yeah, but you're right, yeah. And it's interesting. It's either one or the other. It's always so difficult to think of in between. The gray is so much more difficult to think about, isn't it? But in my opinion, that's the truth.
Yeah. Yes, Jack. Yeah.
It was 38 years ago that the single-child policy went into effect in China, and then the Chinese government withdrew that policy last year. So over the next 20 years, that 38-year generation of the single policy generation will come to dominate the working population of China, and there will be a significant demographic overhang as the large number of retired people are dependent on a relatively small number of working people. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the demographic implications of the single-child policy?
So I'm going to deny. I'm going to grant you 30 seconds, Rob. After the author of an acclaimed book on exactly this topic happens to be sitting over here. So Mei Feng. So you can mix and mingle. You should buy Mei Feng's book, which is great. So what else would you like to say on the topic?
In the presence of Mei Feng, I'm not really sure I want to say too much. But the thing is, like, honestly, I think, well, here's one thing. I think that there's one, we perceive the one-child policy as is all of China follows it. All of China does not follow that policy. You know, the planned birth policy in China is followed by a lot of urbanites, but when you go out into the countryside, which is more than about half the country now, and back when it was in its prime, most of the country, it was routinely, it just wasn't, really didn't apply. You would have people, there were a lot of illegal births, there were a lot of girls being born that were not on the books, and were not put in official counts of the population. So you've got a lot of skewed figures that people are kind of basing a lot of stories on. And so I'm not sure, of course it's going to have an impact, I think, but I don't think it's going to have the impact that we think it will. May, did I answer that okay?
How well? Yes, sir, in the far back. Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. I have a quick question. So can you speak Chinese?
会说, oh.
Oh, okay. So you wrote this book and you have talked to the characters in the book in Chinese or
Yes, in Chinese.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So the question is whether Rob could speak Chinese, and the answer is he certainly can.
I think most of your point of view are objective, so because you can speak Chinese. And I know a lot of American journalists, they have never been to China, and they asked me something about China, but they never been to China, and they are now writing about China. So that's one of the problems, I think.
That's interesting. The statement here is that.
Your point of view are objective.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. But I think that the statement here is that there's not a lot of, or there's some journalists that don't speak the language, and I think knowing the language is important, but I also think it's not completely. It's a tool that you have as a journalist in China. I mean, there's certainly a lot of good journalists in China that can't speak Chinese, but are trying, and I think that they're great journalists, and yes, it may take a part away from some of the understanding of China, but I don't know if it's completely, I don't know. Like I sort of feel like there's a lot of good journalists in China that aren't able to speak, but yeah, I think it certainly helps. Yeah, and having just background knowledge of China obviously helps too.
So here, yes, sir.
There's some discussion among observers of rising nationalism in China,
Right.
and in particular, the Chinese government officials often talk about the fact that they're under intense pressure from the Chinese population to be tough on issues like Taiwan or the South China Sea and so on. I'm interested whether the folks you were talking to had any awareness of these issues.
Oh, sure.
Did they care, and did they have strong views?
They do.
Rising nationalism
Yeah.
on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so most of my characters, whenever we talked about South China Sea, wherever we talked about Taiwan, they were interested in my opinion about it, but I think that their opinion was very much in line with the party's opinion about it, and that's something that with everyday Chinese. Except one. There's one person in my book who sort of questions a lot of this stuff, and he happens to be the youngest character in the book. So I think that there is a generational difference on these types of things. So I think, and there's also obviously it's a level of education too. I think that Chinese over the age of 45, maybe 50 would probably fall into that camp. But I think that a lot of young Chinese have pretty complicated opinions about this. It's maybe not so nationalistic, but it's also, I would say, not pro-American. You know, if you wanted to look at the duality there. But yeah.
So for my metering purposes, everybody who would like to ask a question, if you'd hold up your hand, I want to see how many of them there are. Okay, what I'm going to do is go one by one, everybody holding up a hand, and in a sentence or two, state your question,
Speed
and
round.
we'll amass them, and then Rob will
Okay.
get. So yeah, starting back here.
The kind of like pyramid scheme meetings we're going to, were they primarily schemes that were started in China, or do they seem to have a connection to like Amway or to Herbalife or to like American companies?
So pyramid schemes is question
And
one.
that's a good question.
So we're going to store these up, and you're going to answer them all. So we're going to get.
Yeah, okay, pyramid schemes.
I'm writing them down. Okay,
Thanks.
pyramid schemes. Who is next? Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the youngest person was the most questioning
Yeah.
of the people, and it's something that always fascinates me about younger people in like Russia and China and media is they know that it's not completely free. Like there are words that if they post will disappear, and what on the street level do you hear an inner dialogue going, or is it just completely unrealized?
Okay, question two is about youth and their, yes, sir.
Yeah, actually, to follow up on both previous questions,
Yeah.
how do they see the U.S. in the long term? There are U.S. people that predict there will be obviously a war with China, there are others say not. So just what did the Chinese people think?
Views of the U.S., yes.
What are the Chinese views on poverty reduction and their economic aid program in terms of philanthropy?
Philanthropy, etc. Who's, yes.
So you lived in Sichuan in the 90s and now in Shanghai for the last 6 years. I'm just wondering big differences between that time period and now and living there, and whether you view it as completely separate experiences in your life or a continuum.
Changes over the decades in Sichuan. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the very high housing prices in Shanghai? Because right now the apartment sells for $1 or $2 billion, while probably like the house is sold in Manhattan. So does that affect the lives of the common consumers?
Okay, property crisis in Shanghai, yes.
Feel free to pass on this. You're going to be pretty busy. But I'm curious how your access changed when you, I presumably lost the microphone after recording your broadcast series. What it was like to report the book, and if you felt like you had better access, more natural responses.
Change in modes from reporting by print and broadcast. Yes.
You've spoken to some successful youth, especially in comes to mind the boys studying at Moorhead, studying at Cornell, studying finance. It seems like, and I don't know a ton of the examples, it seems like a lot of these youth success stories rely on perhaps outside success outside of China. What are some of the potential success vectors for youth today within the country?
Ways to succeed inside China, yes.
As a Westerner living in China, have you got any misunderstanding that you found that has been changed after you're living in China?
So how you, misunderstandings you're cleared up by being there. Yes, somebody, yes.
Sort of related to the education question from some Chinese interns we've had. When they come to the U.S., they find that they're allowed to color outside the lines and be more creative. And their thoughts were that the reason a lot of Chinese companies are accused of IPR theft is because they aren't given the creativity within their own education to be able to develop that, and that's why they steal and then just reinvent as opposed to creating their thoughts back.
Okay, so we have 10 questions on the table. Here they are to remind you, Rob, and you have 5 minutes to deal with them.
Wow.
Pyramid schemes, how youth internalize the language of protest.
Can we go one by one?
Okay, yes.
Pyramid schemes. Yes, a lot of those pyramid schemes had something to do with the United States. They usually were schemes, some of them were investment schemes that promised to get this company onto NASDAQ. So that was always the end goal on almost all of these. Oh, it's going to end up on NASDAQ or the London Stock Exchange. So it had a foreign element in that case. Yeah.
Youth and how you see the youth lens on free thinking, etc.
Youth lens on free thinking. What was it?
This was youth in Russia.
So they know their social medias.
Oh yeah, social media. Yeah.
But how do they internalize it?
All the young people I know in China know what's going on. They know that things are censored. They know what people can get away with and what they can't. It's partially because they're on the social media all the time that they see that. And so I think they're much savvier than their parents were about this. Like their parents may have no clue that any censorship is happening, but for them, they absolutely know. They're very cued in onto this. Yeah.
Next question is Chinese views of the long-term future of the U.S. and U.S.-China. The correct answer here is the U.S. is not declining and U.S. and China are not going to war. But what do they think?
I think they think the same thing that we do. I think that they're thinking, oh, but usually what they're, it's a slightly different tone. They ask, when is the United States going to attack us? And I get that question a lot. You know, we're going to go to war. Yeah, no, I think that I get that question a lot from folks. Is that, you know, they're worried about that. I mean, I don't know if they're realistically worried about it, but it's usually something that, you know, that it comes up. You know, and so I have to talk about that, and we sort of talk about that. It's probably not going to happen. You know, there's too many mutual economic interests for that.
So poverty reduction through philanthropy and philanthropy in general.
Well, philanthropy is undergoing a renaissance right now in China because of the money that's been made there. And so I think that we're seeing a lot of billionaires and millionaires in China going towards this, and we're at the start of this. So I think it's just going to become bigger and bigger, and I think it's going to play a pretty big role. Not through foreign NGOs because of what's happening with NGOs in China, but I think inside of China with domestic Chinese organizations.
Rob Schmitz, 1990 Sichuan, Rob Schmitz, 2016.
That was asked from a fellow Peace Corps volunteer who was in my group. So it is completely different being in Shanghai than it was in Zigong, where I lived in Sichuan now and then. However, I think that it is on the continuum because like a lot of our students, you know, I started in the countryside and I ended up in an urban area, and I was also sort of just amazed by this place, just like you know a lot of our students were. Obviously, I was making more money than them, but no, I do see a continuum. But I also see it's so crazily different. And when I've gone back to Sichuan, to go back to the place where I lived, that was also incredible. I could not believe the changes that had happened to that town. Yeah.
Question 6 of 10. The rent is too damn high. Property inflation in Shanghai.
It is too high. I agree. And I think part of the problem right now with property in Shanghai is that I'm worried about this. This is something that I think could pop because, you know, when I look at the value of the apartment that I live in, it is incredibly overvalued because the whole thing's falling apart. The plumbing doesn't work. This thing's like worth, you know, over $1 million, and it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense. And I think part of the bubble is being propped up with these peer-to-peer online lending, which is very interesting phenomenon right now. China's cracking down on this right now, but this has gone pretty far already. And this is it's a way to lend where it's basically underground lending, where a lot of people pull their money and they lend it online from peer to peer, and the interest rates are pretty high. And when those loans come to roost, I have to worry about some of these things. So I think that has played a role in some of that. Not a huge role, but it's definitely played a role.
Number 7, how did your access and perspective change when you went back to these same people without a microphone?
So some of them I went back with a microphone. And I don't think that the access, there was never really a big access issue with any of these folks for me. Because many of them were fine talking to me for the radio series. I had this enormous microphone. So talking to them for, you know, when I told them I was writing a book, they were fine with that. And in some ways, they were even more comfortable with that because I think that they felt that I would get a more complete picture of who they were. And of course I did. And I think that my compassion for them obviously went very high. You know, these are my friends. And so I think in many ways it helped on both sides. But there were definitely a few people who I approached originally for the book when I wanted to write the book who said no for various reasons, and so I stopped bothering for that.
Question number 8. We know the stories of outside success like the Cornell PhD. What are some examples of inside China success?
I think that one of the characters in the book, CK, is a good example of some of the inside success among youth in China. I think one of the ways that young people in China can succeed is by taking risks. That's a difficult thing to do in this culture because of the expectations that are placed on them by their parents. It's very difficult to rationalize to your parents, who you are in many ways their only child, that, oh, I'm just going to start a business, it's going to be okay. And you know, that's not really what a Chinese parent wants to hear. And so CK does that. He does that, and he basically cuts his parents off during that period, and he does very well. And I see a lot of people doing that as well, whether it's startups or whether it's, you know, what have you. But I think that the young Chinese who are well educated and who are able to take some risks, they usually learn a lot, and sometimes they fail, but they usually end up succeeding, I think.
So 2 more questions, 2 more minutes. Number 9, what misperceptions about China of your own changed by your being there?
I think I talked about one before, where when I was talking to Wong about his father, totally thinking that he would say, you know, it was madness, I blame the government for it all. You know, the party, the damn party, you know, Mao is terrible. Instead, he said, no, it's my dad's fault. It's all my dad's fault. That was probably, in the reporting of this book, was the most shocking thing that taught me the most about this is a lot more complicated than I thought it was. You know, and I thought a lot about that after I interviewed him. And it taught me quite a bit. So.
And finally, how about the process of Chinese students learning to color outside the lines as they explore outside China?
Yeah, and I think that's crucial. I think that's a big issue. You know, that's something that when you talk to, you know, I talk to a lot of business leaders when I do my reporting in Shanghai, and this is a big complaint that they have, that it's difficult for folks to, and this is kind of goes in line with the taking risks part, because, you know, taking risks goes against that entire kind of mentality, right? I mean, but when you take a risk and you learn that failing is okay, then you start to innovate and you start to create. I think that's the biggest fear, the fear of failure that stands in between you and innovation. And I think that in China, that's a really big barrier. And you know, when you look at the system that they study under to take the national entrance exam, the Gaokao, studying for the Gaokao, you know, you basically learn how to take a test for years and years and years, and you have to get everything perfectly, right? And so this fear of failure is just kind of embedded in your head, and it's difficult, I think. It takes years to kind of deprogram that from your system. But I think a lot of students who come to America to study or to do work or go abroad or go to Australia or go to Europe, they have better opportunities to kind of break away from that mold. Some of them don't. And some of them don't because when they go abroad, they end up hanging out with their friends who are Chinese. And you may have seen this, where they really don't meet anyone. And they're not really interacting with folks who are not Chinese. I see that as a problem, but I would also say that when Americans go abroad, they do the same thing.
So I have one final 2-sentence passage to read to you. It said, "This beautifully conceived and written book conveys the joys, the tragedies, the comedy, and the vivid humanity of modern China. No one will talk about China's rise or the China model in the same way after reading it, and years from now people will turn to this book to understand the China of this era." This was written by one James Fallows on the back of the book. I meant it when I wrote it.
Did you take that back?
No. It's a great book. I hope you'll go out there and buy it and have Rob sign it, but please now join me in thanking him for his great contribution.